For tonight's speaker, Dean Calbreath is a former reporter for the San Diego Union Tribune who was on the Pulitzer Prize-winning team that uncovered the largest individual bribery scheme in congressional history so far. After retiring from daily journalism, he turned his focus to shedding light on little-known corners of history, and he has been interested in the Civil War since his childhood. His biography of Nicholas Sayet, the Sergeant, has been praised by reviewers and won numerous awards, and tonight he's going to share this fascinating story with us. And remember, after the program, Mr. Calbreath will be signing and selling his book for only $20, so have your wallets open and ready. Thank you very much. Welcome you tonight.
Yeah, I should add that, in terms of the bribery case, it's the largest that we know about. Anyway, this is the book that, so it is about this guy, Nicholas Sayet. This is a colorized version of his 1863 portrait when he joined the 55th Massachusetts. But when he joined the 55th Massachusetts, he had only been in the country for 3 years. He was born in the nation of Borno in Central Africa, a nation that was 1,000 years old at that time, so much older than the United States. At its peak in the 1400s to the 1600s, it was one of the biggest countries in Africa. It was about the size of the United Kingdom and Spain. By the time he was born, because of civil wars and famines and everything, it had shrunk. But even then, it was still about the size of Spain or so. So it was a very important country. He was born in the capital of Kukuwa. This shows the main mosque there. This is a Muslim kingdom and had been Muslim since the year 800 or so. So there's the main mosque, and the Sultan lived right to the right of that. And his father lived in that neighborhood too. His father was the commander of the army, went into battle, there underneath that turban there's an iron helmet, he's wearing a coat of chain mail, riding into battle as if he's, straight out of the Arabian Nights. And he commanded an army of about 5,000 similarly clad warriors. The country was run at that time by Sheikh Omar. Here he is entertaining an ambassador from Germany who was brought along the throne. The Sheikh prefers to sit on his own platform, which is the traditional way, with Turkish rugs and everything laid out. So that is what the throne room looked like. And this is probably what, some of what Barkagana, the general, his wife, Nicholas Sayet's mother looked like. The family had 150 slaves, 50 of them were women, 100 men. The men, typically worked in the fields and everything, although some would have accompanied her. They were a wealthy family. He was the governor of 6 provinces. Oddly enough, he was actually technically a slave himself. He was technically a slave of the sheik. They had a different concept of slavery than in the U.S. To be a slave like he was actually a deep honor, and people vied for that. The treasury of the country was a slave. Like I say, he was the governor of 6 provinces. Every single military officer, not the grunts, but the officers were all slaves. And to be a military officer was an honor. So people actually sold themselves into slavery to get that position. Again, a very different concept of slavery than in the United States. Because he was in a rich family, Nicholas Said went through school where he learned the Quran. He learned, and at this time his name was not Nicholas Said, it was Muhammad Ali Ben Said. He was a strict Muslim. He learned the Quran, he learned Arabic. If he had continued going to school, he probably would have learned Turkish as well as astronomy and mathematics. But when he graduated at about the age of 13, when he graduated from his Quran and Arabic lessons, then he and his friends, to celebrate the graduation, to celebrate a holiday called the Day of the Prophet, the day when when Muhammad was born, Muhammad's birthday, they went out on a hunting expedition in the northern end of the country that borders the Sahara Desert. Now, his mom warned him not to go up there. She says, the desert is full of these Tuareg warriors. If you know Tuaregs, they are the people that, if you've seen the movie Star Wars, that's the people that the Desert Bandits are based on. So his mother warns him not to go there with his friends, about 40 friends or so. But he goes anyway, and they are captured by Tuaregs. They are forced to walk about 2,000 miles barefoot across the Sahara Desert because the best trading markets are in Libya. The closest trading markets are in Libya, 2,000 miles away. They walk across the desert, and in the middle of Libya, he becomes a field slave, basically drawing water up out of the ground to irrigate the fields. No rain in the middle of the Sahara, but there are actual underground aquifers, so he's drawing water out of the aquifer to water the fields. He is totally unused to this kind of work, his overseer whips him every day to get him into shape. And he's given this diet of boiled turnips and dates. That's what he has to exist on. And he complains to the owner. He says, "Listen, this just isn't working out." He says, "Why don't you sell me to an Egyptian or a Turk? Because I've heard good things about them. They treat their slaves better." And the thing is that under the Quran, under Islamic law, you can imagine what the reaction would have been in the southern United States if a slave had said that. Under the Quran, slaves have the ability to complain about what their conditions are and to ask to be sold to a new owner. He does both of those things. The owner doesn't have any responsibility to do what they're asked. But in this case, the owner says, "Okay, I'll sell you to a Turk." And the great thing about Turks is that they have a reputation for paying allowances to their slaves to allow them to eventually buy their way to freedom. So it becomes much more like indentured servitude than slavery. He becomes, under the guidance of a Turk, he becomes a tobacco server, which was very highly prized in the Ottoman Empire. Similar to the way a tea server would be prized in Japan or China. Tobacco serving came with a lot of ritual. It was something that you did to honor a business partner, to make friends with a potential business partner, in diplomatic negotiations, etc. And so tobacco servers were highly prized. He eventually was sold to go to Turkey and serve under the foreign minister, who again, because of his policy of being a foreign minister, he had tobacco servers whenever he met with foreign diplomats. At this time, he was meeting with the Russian, French, and British ambassadors because we were right on the verge of the Crimean War. And so he is, he is listening in on all these negotiations. He has a skill with languages. He's probably picking up a little bit already. Already he speaks Kanuri and Mandara, which are the native languages of his parents, as well as Arabic and now Turkish. So it's, at the age of 18, he's speaking about 4 languages or so, and probably picking up bits and pieces of other. The primary person in Constantinople or Istanbul from Russia is this guy, Alexander Menshikov, who is who is actually, the Russians want to create war. Officially he's there to write a peace treaty, but they want war with Turkey because they think they could get a lot of territory from that. But Menshikov sees Nicholas Said and offers to buy him from the Turks. And the reason for this is the Russians had, for at least 100 years before that, and probably even further, they had a policy of buying slaves that they thought would be valuable, that they thought showed intelligence, and they immediately set them free as soon as they got into Russian territory. They immediately set them free because there was no slavery in Russia. 2/3 of the population were serfs and lived like slaves. But to be a serf, you had to be Russian. If you were non-Russian, then you couldn't be a slave. Slavery was illegal. So, and this shows Peter the Great in the early 1700s with a boy that had been purchased as a slave from Istanbul, whose name was Ibrahim in Arabic, changed to Avram, Avram Petrov Ganibal in Russian. Ganibal was the way Russians say Hannibal. So, named after the general that leads African troops against Rome. So Nicholas Said, so Tsar Peter basically adopts this boy, who grows up to be the third highest rank of the Russian army. A Russian general 200 years before the United States had an African general, African descendant. Now his son also served as a general in the army, and his son was the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin. A very direct kind of connection of fame, that this was Russia's most prized poet. Similarly, in Napoleon's army, there was also an African general whose son, Alexander Dumas, thank you, Alexander Dumas, wrote the Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo. So this is, this is a different way, that there are differences between the way America was treating people and the way Europe was. Not that there was a lot of this, but there were a significant number of people who actually gained fame, and also a significant number of people who, even though they didn't gain fame, came to good living in Europe. The Tsar of Russia, he was able to attract, among other things, he attracted three African Americans, one of whom had gone over to service with John Quincy Adams as an aide in the U.S. Embassy, and the Russians treated him better than John Quincy Adams did. So this was a long-standing practice there. Nicholas Said became an assistant to a Russian prince, and together they traveled throughout Europe. They'd go to Germany and Austria in the fall, Italy in winter, France in spring, England in summer, and during this time, he was picking up languages: Russian, German, Italian, French, English. And from what people have said of him is that he not only picked up the languages, but he thoroughly enjoyed their literature. He was able to talk about the books that he was reading and everything. So he picked up those languages there. And like I say, he already spoke Canary and Mandara, Turkish and Arabic, and he continued to pick up languages as his travels continued. Basically learned biblical Greek from a Presbyterian minister, learned Hebrew from a Jewish community leader in the United States when he finally came here. And in the meantime, he was meeting or crossing paths at least with people like Louis Napoleon, with Queen Victoria, and with Tsar Nicholas, who was basically his indirect namesake. His employer at the time was Nicholas Trubetskoy. Nicholas Trubetskoy was a godson of Tsar Nicholas. He got his name from Tsar Nicholas. He gave that name to Nicholas Said when Nicholas Said was baptized into the Russian Orthodox Church. Finally, after 5 or 6 years, Nicholas Said says, "Okay, I want to go back home to Africa." The Russian prince tries to convince him, "No, why don't you stay with me? I can give you, I can make sure that when you do go back to Africa, you'll be a wealthy man." But he says, "No, I want to go back." And while he's waiting for a ship to take him back in London, he meets a Dutch nobleman who says, "Listen, I'm about to get married to an English woman. I don't have any servants with me, don't have an aide. How would you like to be my valet de chambre," which is like a right-hand man, kind of like a personal assistant. And you can see the United States. I'm going to travel to the New World. Go to the U.S., Canada, and the Caribbean. You can see all this. I'll be gone for a year, and then you can come back and you can be again a wealthy man. And Nicholas Said says, my search for adventure, trumped his desire to go home, so he decides to go. Unfortunately, this guy was was a bit of a fraud. Didn't have the money he said he did. Ran out when he was in Detroit, Michigan. And so Nicholas Said, at this time, they arrived in late 1860, and that is the correct date up there. In late 1860, they arrived in downtown Detroit, and which is right, basically, they're still there when war is declared, 1861. As soon as war is declared, Nicholas Said goes to a recruiting office, but is told that the army is for whites only, which really thoroughly surprises him, because he knows that there were black generals in France and Russia, and he has seen, foreign armies. He has seen, blacks in the British Army, in the French Army, and the Turkish Army. So he is kind of surprised that in this war that is about slavery, that they aren't allowing blacks into the army. And this was a difference from the way the U.S. was founded. I mean, this guy here, Salem Poor, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, he's the guy that shot the British commander. So, back then, there were African Americans in the army. This is from the 5th Rhode Island, which successfully defeated 3 attempts of assault by Hessians. And this is the, Haitian volunteers, African Haitian volunteers, helping defend Savannah against the British coming in and reclaiming it. Unfortunately, that didn't work. The British reclaimed it, and a lot of these troops died. But they were integral parts of the American Revolution. As soon as the Revolution was over, they got banned from the army because of the South. Because Southerners didn't want armed veterans, to maybe someday come and free their slaves. And they remained banned until the middle of the Civil War. So Nicholas Said, thinks, well, how can I help, my people? How can I help, the African Americans? And one thing that he did was he taught French at a private school in Detroit. There was a strong African American middle class in Detroit at that time. And there was also a strong desire to learn French because you're right across the river from Canada. A lot of bilingual operations taking place. So he did, he taught at a local school until there was a race riot in 1863. This is before the so-called draft riots, which were more race riots than draft riots. There was 1 or 2 actual draft riots, but most of them were very racially oriented. And this riot burned down much of the African American community. Unfortunately, there were only 2 deaths, but about 30 buildings were burned, including the school that he taught at. But right about the time that he was teaching at that school, the 54th Massachusetts was going into towns all over the northern states, whatever towns had an African American community, and they were recruiting soldiers for the 54th. Come to Massachusetts, and you can join the army. This is after the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. After that, kind of paved the way for Africans to join the army. He didn't join the 54th because he came a little too late. He joined the 55th, which was formed by the runoff of the 54th. And I know that there was a Pasadena resident, you probably all are pretty familiar, who was also in the 55th, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. When they were recruited, the recruitment was, colored men rally around the flag of freedom, Hey, $13 a month, which is how much white soldiers were being paid at the time. Good food and clothing, state-aged families. Now, as it turned out, a lot of that was not true. Although it wasn't Massachusetts' fault, it was the federal government stepped in. And caused some reluctance among some African Americans to even join the army. A reason was black soldiers were paid $7 as a private, $7 as a sergeant major. That was what they were paid. And sergeant major was the highest post that they could get. They weren't going to be a lieutenant or a captain or anything. Those under federal law, Massachusetts wanted black commissioned officers. The feds did not. So as a result, the captain and the lieutenant of Naval Society's company, Company I, the 55th, that lieutenant is 17 years old. He had gotten written permission from his parents, because that's what he needed if you're under the age of 18. He got written permission from his parents at the age of 16. And actually, to tell the truth, he was an okay recruit. He actually had some experience and had been promoted to corporal before getting the jump to first lieutenant here. But there were people in the 55th who were, the Army was discouraging people from joining the 55th because they thought that if you're a skilled lieutenant, if you're a skilled officer material, we want you to see you in a white regiment, not a black regiment. There is another 17-year-old also that's a first lieutenant in another unit. Now he, Captain John Gordon, had a very serious problem with chronic diarrhea, and she was a killer at the time, of course. So he was often out of commission for sometimes a month or two at a time. So the 17-year-old was the commander of a company where the age ran up to 44. There are people in the 30s and 40s taking orders from the 17-year-old. If you've seen the movie Glory, my favorite Civil War film, then you might know the next bit, which is that Colonel Robert Will Shaw, or Matthew Broderick as he's well otherwise known, where he is, he's worried. He has heard these rumors, because at this time they're only rumors. He's heard these rumors that they'll be paid $7 a month. And he wants to prove them to be good soldiers. So he volunteers them for a full frontal attack on that fort you see in the background, a fort loaded with 1,000 men, 14 cannons. You have to advance 3/4 of a mile across the sand so you can get to the bottom layer of the fort, which is surrounded by a moat, which has abatis pointing out from the sand and everything. It's basically a suicide mission. What the movie Glory doesn't tell you is that a week before this happened, there was an assault by white Union troops that didn't even get to the fort. They didn't get close. They were cut off by gunshots, by cannon shots and everything. They suffered terrible tragedy, terrible casualties, and turned away. Robert Will Shaw volunteers his men to be the lead of the next assault, just to show their capabilities. And this was the alleged response from the general in charge of the operation. And put those down. Yeah. So they assault about a third of the assaulting force is killed or wounded, or they're forced to retreat. But they did get to the top, and they even crossed the top of the fort before being pushed back. And then a week later came the paymaster. And that's when they were offered their $7 a month, and they refused to take any money. They said, to quote one of them, to accept our pay in this way would degrade us and mark us as inferior soldiers, and would be a complete annihilation of our manhood. They felt like if they accepted any money lower than what a white soldier was taking, then that would just say that they were accepting that they were inferior, and they didn't want to do that. Technically, that was an act of mutiny, but the Army probably thought, okay, we can get them for free. So that was the 54th. The 55th came in just a few days after that assault. And by this time, because of 2 failed assaults for a frontal attack, then the Army decided, okay, instead of doing a frontal attack, we're going to dig our way to the fort and gradually advance our cannons closer and closer, and try to squeeze them out that way, which they did. The Confederates actually finally retreated late at night and went out the back entrance, and the Union Army took the fort the next day. Beyond digging those trenches, Nicholas Said and his troops and other members of the 55th helped build this swamp battery in the middle of the swamp to house a cannon that was capable of shooting more than 5 miles, capable of shooting right into the port of Charleston. In order to get this in the swamp, which is 15 feet of swamp mud, basically, they had to sink 800 tons of sandbags, which was one of the duties, to fill with sandbags. They also helped build a communication tower, signal tower. And in 1864, they helped guard the retreat from the Battle of Odyssey, where the 54th was instrumental in also guarding the retreat. By this time, they had been in the Army for 10 months without getting any pay at all, which was bad for them, but was just especially bad for their family left behind. Most soldiers would send every month, or whenever the paymaster came, they would send money to their families. These soldiers couldn't do that. And they were getting letters from their families talking about going hungry, talking about not being able to pay for medicines. Just kind of very sad tales, which of course weighed heavily on the officers, on the soldiers. Here, Nicholas Said, this was anonymous, but I'm pretty sure with Nicholas Said, he had a special relationship with the Daily Evening Transcript of Boston. Money is very much needed, but I do not believe there are 20 who will take less than what we enlisted for. It is very shameful to treat men who expose their lives and forsake their homes this way. Now, at this time, one other thing happens, which is that Captain Charles Soule of Company K in the 55th accidentally shoots and kills their lieutenant. That's 17-year-old, well, by this time he's been 18 for a couple of weeks, the 18-year-old lieutenant. The men had grown to love this lieutenant, who was a great guy, universally praised as a great guy. This really impacted them kind of bad. And that's where future Pasadena resident Thomas Ellsworth comes in. I guess most people know that he received the Medal of Valor for his part in the war. He lived in right across the street from the Gamble House, although that house has since been torn down, but it was a house he built. He was a construction guy. And this is another house that he built that's still standing about 2 miles from here. And this is his grave in Mountain View Cemetery. So he enlisted in the 2nd Massachusetts on June 20th, 1862, fought at Antietam and Gettysburg, where he was wounded in the ankle, was promoted to corporal, and served in Sir Sherman's march through Georgia and the Carolinas. Because of serving in that march, he and the 2nd Massachusetts were actually in the neighborhood when Dennis Jones was shot and killed. And he was chosen to replace Jones. So he was directly in charge of Nicholas Said. He took on a leadership position as lieutenant, even though technically he was still a corporal in 2nd Massachusetts. The paperwork didn't come through for a month or so, maybe a couple months. And the men knew this. The men knew that he was technically a corporal. The men knew that he didn't necessarily have the authority that he claimed. To assert his authority, within his first week in the company, he ended up arresting 10 soldiers, often for minor infractions. And he's basically, it's totally, to me, it's understandable, but also regrettable, because they're already in this crisis point, and he's sort of throwing oil on the fire by arresting these guys. And I totally understand why his motivations for doing it. He wanted to get these guys to listen to him, but it was not really the best. One of the soldiers was a 20-year-old former slave from Kentucky. About 10 to 30%. The majority of people in the 55th were freedmen, freeborn. About 10 to 30% were former slaves. Some of them had run away specifically to join the 55th. Based on regimental records, he probably served in Nicholas Said's platoon. The regimental records don't show which platoon had which people, but a footnote to my book goes into this. And he was described by his fellow soldiers as a foolish fellow, not very rational, hard to understand, kind of strange, always awkward, not a sensible man. So, he was sort of maybe a class clown kind of guy. But despite his apparent learning difficulties, he had never raised any kind of fuss in the company prior to Ellsworth's arrival. When Ellsworth arrives, however, Ellsworth, really tries to lay it on him by assigning him to pioneer duty, which is kind of a punishment for the soldiers. So Baker got into, after 2 days of pioneer duty, Baker got into a fist fight with Ellsworth, drawing cheers from other soldiers in the company, including his corporal, Sergeant Said and Captain Gordon, were both in sickbed at the time, weren't present. Baker was sent to the guardhouse where he was bucked and gagged. After a quick court-martial, Baker was found guilty of mutiny and spent the next 6 weeks in the guardhouse so they could sentencing. Now, in the meantime, after nearly a full year of going unpaid, protests over the pay issue in 54th, 55th were becoming much more vocal. On June 15th, the 55th had its biggest protest, with 120 soldiers stacking their weapons and refusing to go on duty. Their protest was short-lived because the commanding officer, Alfred Hartwell, stripped the leader of his sergeant's rank and threatened that anyone else who remained on strike would be court-martialed and shot. 2 days later, 2 days after this, Wallace Baker received his sentence, which was the firing squad. You know, which even a lot of the officers said this was a questionable thing. Even though there had been a fist fight, there were extenuating circumstances that I think in any other atmosphere, he would have been sent to jail or something. He would have done a hard time, but he would not have been shot. But they wanted to send a message to the rest of the regiment. So he ended up paying the price. Now, in the days following his death, Nicholas Said led his soldiers on 2 military expeditions, including the Battle of Fort Lamar, where the 55th successfully attacked a Confederate battery and retrieved 2 cannons and everything. But by now, I think after the execution of Wallace Baker, Nicholas Said was questioning his role in the Army. He stayed long enough for the pay issue to be resolved. The men did receive their pay in October, and on the day that he received, they were told they were getting their pay, he resigned. He voluntarily resigned, got knocked to private, and he said he wanted to be assigned to the hospital tent, probably because he wanted to study medicine, but probably because I think he was through being a leader in this army. A week, or like 10 days after he joined the hospital, was the Battle of Honey Hill, which was one of the most lopsided battles of the war, with 740 Union casualties versus 40 Confederates.
Wow.
Now, this is the battle in which Ellsworth, Lieutenant, who's now Captain Ellsworth, received a captain of another country, a company. They got him out of the company not. But he rescued the wounded Colonel Alfred Hartwell, his commander, the regimental commander, and pulled himself out from a dead horse, which is how he got his medal. What wasn't mentioned in his medal, I think, is that there was actually a black soldier who also helped him, who ended up getting killed. But Ellsworth got his medal, and in the meantime, Nicholas Said was attending the field hospital, which looks something like this, with a bunch of, dying people, wounded and dying people just lying on the grass outside. What had been a plantation chapel that had been taken over and made into a hospital. Nicholas Said stayed with the 55th through the occupation of Charleston, and then after the war, he decided he was going to stay in the South. He decided the best thing he could do is to teach freed slaves how to read and write. In addition, he was one of the nation's first black voting registrars. He helped sign up about 500 former slaves to vote, among other things. And then he went on tour of the South, trying to teach people the accomplishments of what an African can do, what an African is capable of. is toward chicken from Charleston down to Georgia, across Alabama, Mississippi, up to Tennessee, and he got pretty good reviews too. You know, the Atlanta Constitution, he talks intelligently on almost every subject, an intelligent Native American, well acquainted with the different languages, the most remarkable linguist we ever saw. And at this time, he was also building schools, or either building schools or teaching at already established schools, again, from about more than half a dozen from Charleston up to Brownsville, Tennessee. He disappeared from the public eye in the 1870s after the Reconstruction usually closed. His last public record has him is in August 1882 when he's living in Brownsville, living in a sharecropper's home while teaching school. And he probably either died or left the country by 1897 when he would have been in his early 60s. So this is his philosophy. My honest and ardent desire is to render myself useful to my race wherever it may be. I have no aspirations for fame nor anything of the sort, but I shall always prefer at all times to find myself in the midst of the most ignorant of my race and endeavor to teach the rising generation the advantages of education. To me, it is impossible to conceive how a human being can be happy through any other channel than to do as much good as possible to his fellow man in this world. So that's Nicholas Sage. Yeah.
How did you discover this amazing story?
It came after 9/11. After 9/11, I was sent by the Union Tribune to report on the Arab Street, and I was in Bethlehem University. Bethlehem University, which is a Palestinian school, talking to them about what they thought about 9/11, and then they started asking me questions, including how long had Muslims lived in the United States, what had they been treated like, and a number of other questions, some of which I knew the answers to, but a lot of them I didn't. And so when I came home, I decided, okay, well, I'm going to look up the history of Muslims. One thing I did was searching historical records from Muhammad and other Muslim names, and I actually ended up finding the first free Muslims. There were slaves who were Muslims throughout the slavery era, but the first free Muslims were in New Amsterdam, New York City, 15 years after the Mayflower landed. So it was. So I found numerous Muslims throughout the 200 years before the Civil War. But then my agent said, you should just concentrate on one guy. And he actually wrote 2 sets of memoirs, which unfortunately leave out the Civil War because he was living in the South. He didn't want people to know he fought the Civil War. He said in his biography, I arrived in this country in 1867 instead of 1860, so I can't be blamed for anything else that went on. So I had to do a lot of that research on my own, but so that's how I found it. It was all because of that Muslim connection.
Okay, so in this country before the Civil War, you could be a slave, black, African, or you could be a free black. Did you carry a special document, or?
You carried a special document. Even during the Civil War, there were free blacks in the South. But you had to carry a special document document with you at all times. You know, when I talk about the middle class African Americans in Detroit, almost all of them came from Fredericksburg, Virginia, where they have been free blacks. But unfortunately, the South, you know, started imposing these anti-black rules that applied to you whether you were a slave or free. You couldn't go to a church that wasn't approved by the white establishment. There had to be a white person at that church to monitor it. You know, so a lot of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of education. You couldn't, in the state of Virginia and a couple other states, you couldn't have your child educated. If you had your child educated and you caught the teacher, both the child and the teacher could be punished. You know, if it was a white teacher, they would be fined, you know, a substantial fine, and they would be publicly whipped. You know, if you sent your child out of state to get an education, that child couldn't return. So, so even though there were free blacks, you know, they were intensely restricted. So a lot of them, when these laws started being implemented, they'd been living in Fredericksburg, Virginia, until about 1831 or something. When the South, when Virginia especially started implementing these laws, they just moved en masse to what was then the frontier of Michigan. Yeah. So yeah, even if you were free, and even in the northern states, there were some limitations of what you could do. In a lot of northern states, you couldn't vote. You couldn't, not all, you could vote in New England and stuff, but in a number of northern states you couldn't vote. Hard to own property and stuff, but at least you had freedom of speech, education, you know, and religion and other groups.
I take it from your story, he never did get back to Africa as far as you know.
As far as I know, he never did. Yeah, he always talked about, you know, wanting to go back. It wouldn't surprise me. But by this time, I don't know, I've lived overseas and lived in Prague for 4 years or something. My friends always say, you know, if you live for 5 years in one place, you're always going to feel like you're an expat wherever you are. And he had lived for 20 years, but, you know, 20 to 30 years. So probably he had adjusted to life in the United States. Yeah.
He never married?
He did marry twice. You know, unfortunately, you know, he was a true Victorian. He didn't like talking about his any, you know, love relations or whatever. But he did have, he did talk about one love affair he had in Austria when he was still working for the Russians, and also reading between the lines, an affair with a couple of English housemaids. And interestingly, talking about the differences between Europe and America at the time, his employer and the person who managed the estate where he had this affair, they warned him that by consorting with housemaids, they were far below his station. He was actually superior to them. He had a superior station as a valet de chambre. And he was warned, if you continue to do this, we'll knock your status off. And so he decided not to do that. You know, I mean, there was definitely, you know, it's not like Europe was devoid of racism, but class kind of superseded race. And he was perceived as being in the upper class. You know, Valet de chambre is a gentleman's gentleman. You know, I mean, you were perceived as being a gentleman. So anyway, so he had an affair there. He got married right after the war, but it doesn't seem to have lasted very long. Then he got married again in Alabama, which apparently there was, the timing of it works out that he was there during a wave of yellow fever, which I think may have killed his wife and stepson because they kind of disappeared in history. He did have one child that he probably didn't even know about. When he was on his lecture tour, he had a brief relationship with a young woman in Georgia, and he just kept going on the road, and she had her child, and she had no way of contacting him. You know, she did not know where he had gone to. So my guess is he never even knew that he had a child.
So when he was on tour, were those audiences segregated?
I don't think so. They may have been segregated in terms of, you know, if you spoke at a church or something, you know, in churches, both in the north and in the south, not all places in the north, but a lot of places. You know, there was a section for whites and a section for African Americans in the balcony. You know, they were supposed to be out of sight from the white worshipers. So if you spoke at a church, that's probably the structure. But I did read, there was a letter written by a Alabama businessman who said how he gave a good lecture to the black and white audience. So my assumption is that at that particular spot, and maybe others too, there was an integrated audience. You know, maybe in light of the Civil War, maybe some barriers were dropped during the Reconstruction that rose up again once the Reconstruction was over.